Simpleton is a person who can be cheated very easily, who is not aware of the worldly things. Okay, so where she could get the address and all she recalls. So that time she remembers that her mother had given Darling's address years ago. Though the address was correct, she didn't want to remember it anymore. Whenever she visited, she used to take some nice thing with her. That is because she wanted to preserve everything. Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to all the young minds of class 11 CBSE. I am Dr. Shalini here, your English teacher at Prep School. Today we are here to understand one of the lessons from your snapshots, that is the address. This is written by Marga Menko. So let us see what is there in today's session. We'll understand about the author first, then we'll move on to the theme of the lesson and we'll understand the characters that are there, and let us go on to the summary. So let us start with the introduction of the author here. So Marga Menko was a Dutch journalist and a writer. So Menko published her first book. This is in German name, so it means the bitter herb. It has a nameless character there which goes through that war experience in the reminiscence of the authors. So in this lesson also she talks about the reminiscences of war only. She was too affected by the thought of this war, the experience of this war. So that's the reason she carried the same theme in many of her stories. So let us start with the theme of this story. So this story is actually a touching story of a girl who goes in search of the mother's belongings, okay, after the World War II, and this takes place in Holland. The setting of the story is Holland. Okay, so even after finding whatever she wanted to find, that is finding all her mother's belongings, she doesn't want to bring it back. Why is that? We are going to understand here. Though she wanted everything to remember her mother, she didn't want to bring everything back. Finally, she feels that cannot bring her dead mother back, so she leaves everything there and comes out. The address held so much importance till she visited the place. She had one address and wherein she could go and find the belongingness. That was so very important for her, but later on that has no importance at all. Once she comes out of that address, that has no importance at all. So she realizes that this address would bring nothing but pain. Okay, so this is actually the theme of the story. Let us start with the summary. This is divided into various stages so that you can remember it better. So let us start with the first character. We need to understand the characters first. The first one is the daughter. The name is not mentioned here. It is only the daughter that is said over here. And daughter is actually the narrator of this story. So it is in first person narration. She returns to Holland to go to the address. So she comes from somewhere to Holland. She wanted to visit that address there where her mother's precious belongings were kept. Okay, so after the situation was normal, that is after the World War II was over, after the situation gets back to normal, she goes to that address wherein the belongings were kept. So that is the daughter. The next character is Mrs. S. Okay, Mrs. S is actually all in the memory of that daughter. She actually doesn't exist as a character, but wherever Mrs. S appears, it is all in the memory of the daughter only. So she is the narrator's mother and she was a simpleton. A simpleton is a person whom you can cheat very easily, not a person who is very simple, who leads a very simple life. Simpleton is a person who can be cheated very easily, who is not aware of the worldly things. Okay, so that is a simpleton. Yeah, Mrs. S also was a simpleton. She could not see the manipulations, that is the cheating nature, that is the fraudulent nature of Mrs. Darling, who is another character here. So Mrs. Darling was her acquaintance. Acquaintance is a person whom you know for quite a long time. Okay, so that is acquaintance, and she trusted Mrs. Darling and also allowed her to take all her belongings for time being, because yeah, I'll not tell you the reason because we are going to come across that when I tell you the summary. So Mrs. Darling is another character in this story. She was very old acquaintance of Mrs. S. She was actually cunning and she did not have good intention. She was very reluctant to recognize when this daughter visited, Mrs. S daughter visited this address, that is Mrs. Darling's house. Okay, so now let us understand what the story is all about. So the summary, the story starts with Mrs. Darling's indifferent attitude. So how does it happen first? opens with the narrator knocking the door of Mrs. Darling. So she knocks at the door, and this door was actually slightly open, that belonged to a house. Okay, so she goes and knocks at the house. The door was open for a winch, means just for a peep. Okay, it was not completely open, it was just open slightly, wherein with one eye one can see what is happening outside. So upon asking, Mrs. Darling appears there. So Mrs. Darling says that she doesn't recognize the narrator. So she tells, have you come back? But she says, yes, I have come back. But Mrs. Darling doesn't want to recognize the narrator. She is least bothered about who this narrator is. Yes, she could recognize, but she didn't want to show that she recognized the narrator. Narrator thought that she might have gone to the wrong house. Now the narrator thinks, since Darling did not recognize her, she thinks that she has gone to a wrong place. So she goes to the house. There is somebody who is inside the house also. There was a passage. After that passage, there is a door, and the door opens and closes. So that also she notices, that is the narrator notices that when the door opens, there was a kind of muggy smell. Means for a long time, if door of a room, then a kind of smell comes, right? So that is called as a muggy smell. So that kind of smell comes there, and she also observes that. That is this daughter who has gone there observes that, but she doesn't pay much attention to that. When Mrs. Darling is talking, she feels that she has gone to a wrong address. Mrs. Darling doesn't even open the door at all. Okay, she doesn't open the door. She doesn't even call this lady inside. She doesn't even open the door and talk to that. That much of courtesy also she doesn't have. But the author recognizes, though she feels that she has gone to a wrong address, the narrator feels that she has gone to a wrong address, but later she feels that no, she has gone to the correct address because Mrs. Darling was wearing a cardigan which belongs to this Mrs. S. Okay, the mother of the narrator. So she recognizes that cardigan, and that cardigan also was very shabby there. Okay, that the buttons and all, they showed that this was not washed from a long time. Because of that glimpse of her mother's knitted cardigan, she could recognize that she has gone to the proper address. So Mrs. Darling somehow avoids talking to the narrator and shamelessly shuts the door. So she doesn't even let her inside, she just closes the door. So now this narrator just wants to come out of the house. She just steps back and she just observes the window there. There is someone behind the curtain. She just opens the curtain, looks at the author and closes it. So narrator feels that yes, this person, there must be somebody else inside. Then that person must have asked this lady who has come. Then maybe this lady has told nothing like that. Nobody related to us. The person who must not have spoken much about it. So all those things she thinks, and she was about to come back from that place. So this is the opening scene of the story here. So the narrator now recalls from her memory. Now she is coming back, walking back from the from that house there. So after Mrs. Darling refuses to recognize her, the narrator just walks back to the gate. That is, she walks out of the house and she walks to the station, that is the railway station. That is, the narrator tells Mrs. Darling that I have come only for this. I have got a train, I have got into a train and I have come only for this. But Mrs. Darling doesn't recognize her at all. Now she was walking back to the railway station. So that time she was just thinking, she was in her thoughts about her mother only, thoughts of her mother only. Now she recalls where did she see Mrs. Darling first. So then she recalls her mother's words there. Okay, so where she could get the address and all she recalls. So that time she remembers that her mother had given Darling's address years ago. So ages ago she had told that during the first half of the war. So what does the mother say? One day when she was there in her mother's house, she gets up late and comes down from upstairs. So that time this mother was about to meet someone, that is Mrs. Darling. So that time she tells her, see, this is Mrs. Darling, she lives there in number 46 Marconi Street and all. She tells her. So only that she remembers. That is before the war the mother has told about Mrs. Darling. So that was the first part. When did she notice that some things were actually missing from that place? She tells about Mrs. Darling, and the mother also tells that whenever Mrs. Darling came, she took something with her. Okay, she would say that she wanted to preserve everything, all the nice things. The situation was so that the Jews were actually searched and they were to be killed. Hitler had ordered like this. So what happened? Here they were Jews actually, the narrator and all, no? So they were Jews. So that time, any time for that matter, they were supposed to vacate the place. Okay, so that time she had very nice things at her house. Okay, she had all nice things in her house. She had set up her house very well. That is the narrator's mother. Now, whenever Mrs. Darling came, all these years she was not in touch at all. So very recently only Mrs. Darling had come and she had renewed the relationship. So very recently she had come there. She was talking to the author's, that is the narrator's mother and all. Whenever she visited, she used to take some nice thing with her. That is because she wanted to preserve everything. If it is war, then anytime they had to vacate that place, that time they would not be able to take all these nice things. So giving this reason, so Mrs. Darling took one nice thing whenever she used to come there. But what did narrator's mother think about that? She was very grateful for what Mrs. Darling is doing. Mrs. Darling could have asked them only to shift with them. But she did not do that. She only took the materials with her. She did not care for the humans. She only cared about the materialistic things. So that apart, we'll come back to the story. Mrs. S was actually obliged with this action of Mrs. Darling because it was risky during the war. Carrying those things also was actually very risky during the war. But she was doing it. It was like she is doing a great favor for Mrs. S. So that is what Mrs. S tells. Now, all these things the narrator recalls from her memory. So as she was walking back, she didn't want to notice anything on the either side of the road, be it the shop or the houses or anything for that matter, because she didn't want that to be associated with her memory. She would become nostalgic. So she didn't want anything in her memory. She didn't want to recall all those things. So she just walked off to the railway station. So this was the first visit that the narrator gave to Mrs. Darling's house. Then narrator recalls something else also. Yeah, as I told, she was walking through the familiar places, but she didn't want to recall that. She didn't want to get herself upset because all those places were full of memories. That is, full of memories of her mother. Now, in the train, she remembers where she met Mrs. Darling. So, her mother had told about Mrs. Darling, as I told you before, she had told, and that time when she met her mother, she was wearing a brown coat and a shapeless hat. You know, a hat occupies a very important place in Western culture. That is because of the climate. And here she is talking about the shapeless hat. So, maybe she means to say that she could not afford for a very good hat also. That means they were not well off. She was just carrying things from their house. So this is how she tells that they were not well off. But later when she sees all the things, they were like, they were so rich. Okay, so she talks about that also. And that time, the narrator asks her mom if Mrs. Darling was living far away from the place where they were staying. So mother had told, that time she had told the address. She stays over there, she had told. So that one, the author was, it was still in her memory, the address. Okay. So then this narrator was very reluctant to leave from that place, that is her belongings. So now narrator comes to her mom's house and sees there were a lot of things that were missing. And the mother was actually very happy that the narrator could recognize that there were a lot of things that were missing. Okay, so she tells that very quickly you identified that. So I have given this to Mrs. Darling, who has been doing this for us. So she narrates the whole thing, whatever has happened. So she was not at all happy that her mother had let Mrs. Darling take everything. Now, after this war was over, this narrator was not at all interested to go and see whatever her mother belongings were there with Mrs. Darling. Okay, so she didn't want to go there. She didn't want that memory to haunt her, but she was scared that she might become nostalgic if she saw the things in boxes and cupboard. You know where those things had to be kept, but where are the things kept? They are kept in boxes and cupboards. They are not in their original place. So she was very reluctant to go there. Okay, she didn't want to visit that place at all. So gradually, after life came back to normal, the author tells all these, okay, how bread started turning into the original color, how everything came back to normalcy. So after life became normal, this author grows very curious. That is, the narrator grows very curious to know about the possessions of her mother. She wanted to see where they are. She wanted to get back the memory of her mother. So first initially she was very reluctant to see, but later she was very curious. She starts growing curious to know about the belonging. So first attempt was actually a failure. Then she decides to visit again. So this time who opens the door? It was a girl of 15 years old who opened the door. It was not the mother, it was a 15-year-old girl. She asks if Mrs. Darling was there, but the girl says no, she is not there. She is doing some errand, means she is busy with some other work. Narrator says okay, I'll wait for her. So the girl leads her through the passage, and on the way she sees the candle stand. Okay. Hanukkah candle stand was there, so that also she says. Old-fashioned iron candle was there. That was not at all used in the narrator's house. It was just kept as a showpiece because it was very cumbersome. It was very difficult for them to use it. They were not using it much. So she follows the girl through the passage. She just looks at the candle stand and she walks there, and that time she is led to a living room. So as she entered the living room, she sees that all the belongings of her mother are lying there. How are they lying? They're just dumped there. They're just lying in a very haphazard way, in a very tasteless manner they are arranged there. Okay, so that showed that Mrs. Darling did not have any taste at all in arranging the things or taking care of the house. So that was how they were arranged. There was ugly furniture also, and that muggy smell was there. It was like the room did not have ventilation for years long. Okay, so that was the situation there, and all the belongings were kept there. Now, the girl invites her. Narrator is just saying she was in a place, it was not known to her, but she knew that place. Means she was surrounded by the belongings of her mother. That means that's a very familiar face, but that is kept in a very strange place. Means not a very well-known place. Okay, so that's what the author says over here. So the tablecloth, the silver cutlery, etc., everything, whatever she is seeing around over there, so everything belonged to them only. Okay, so the silver cutlery they were using, that occupied a very important place here. Okay, so now the narrator visits again and finds all these things here. So she finds all the belongings of her mother in the living room. So now narrator observes something. So Mrs. Darling's daughter was actually placing the cups for the tea to be served. Daughter has kept some tea ready for her mother. At the same time, this narrator comes. So she tells her to have tea. So that time she observes the tea cup. She was pouring this tea from a white teapot that had golden border on the lid. So this golden border she observed. She also took out some spoons from the box. So everything the narrator was observing. She could see that all that what she was using belonged to them only. That golden border, that teapot and all. So everything it belonged to them only. So all this crockery, whatever items she is using, belonged to the narrator's family only. But the girl was not aware of it. The narrator gets an idea that she has to tell the girl that it belongs to them. Okay, the narrator indirectly hints the girl that they actually belong to them. How does she tell that? She asks the girl whether she knew that these were silver items. Even the narrator did not know herself that they were silver items, because her mother had not told her that, and she only knew when her mother asked for the daughter's help to get it polished. Okay, so mother, that is in her memory, that is the pre-war, that time the mother asks her daughter, get this polished. So that time she gets to know that it is silver. Every day whatever they are eating, that is all in silver they are eating. So now she asks this daughter of Mrs. Darling's whether she knew that it was a silver cutlery what they are using. And the narrator also remembered her mother asking her to polish the silver cutlery. So she remembers that, and she wanted to hint the girl that it belongs to them. So she says maybe it belongs to somebody else. It may be missing from their original place is what she says. But the daughter understands it in a different way. She just goes back and she goes to show that, means she had more spoons over there. She just points out there, see, we have so many things here and similar kind that are there. Okay, so now she decided that she should not stay there anymore. Narrator is upset. She didn't want to stay there at all. Now, though the address was correct, she didn't want to remember it anymore. Okay, so that was the first thing she wanted to forget. Though she wanted to forget all the things that belonged to her mother, she wanted to forget the address first. Okay. So she felt that these objects linked to a memory of her mother no longer existed. Means her mother itself doesn't exist. So what is the use of getting those things back is what the narrator thought. now they had lost their value at all. Now they did not have value at all. Now they had lost all the value. So she just wanted to leave them and she wanted to go. So narrator comforts herself. Now she wants to leave the things and go back. So what does she think about that? How does she convince herself to leave everything there and go? So she comforts herself that her house was too small. That present house, that is the rented house in which she is staying now, it was too small to accommodate all these stuff. Okay, so she stays in a very small house, rented house, and all these things will not fit. So let it be here only, let it be lying as it is. At least they are kept in some place which wherein they are safe. So she leaves all her family's belongings there back, and she just starts from that darling's house. Though the daughter comes and asks her to stop for a while, wait for her mother, she doesn't even bother at all. She just walks off from Mrs. Darling's house. So this is the summary of the address. So this is a wonderful lesson. You can read it within 15 to 20 minutes. It's a very short story, and you can understand the feelings of the author that she has tried to express there. And you will also understand the pre-war and the post-war situations there in the story. So what I would suggest, please go through the video, listen to it, then read the lesson. You will understand it better. You will be able to get all the feelings and emotions of the author who has tried to express it there. So thanks for your time. Please come back prepared to the class. We'll discuss the question and answers in the live class. So take care, keep learning. See you shortly. Bye-bye.